Hello and welcome to Ashgrove Online. My name's Dave and I'm the senior pastor here at the church. And I'm glad that you've joined with us today, and I want you to know that we're a church that values community, living in authentic relationship with each other. And in this season it might look a little different, but it's not impossible. It starts right here with you connecting in for church online. So wherever you are in the journey of life, I'm glad that you've joined with us today. And if you'd like to get in touch with me or one of the pastors, please head over to the Contact Us tab at our website, ashgrove.org.au. But for now, stay tuned. Ashgrove Online will start in just a few moments.
G'day, it's good to be here with you today. My name's Jordan Thayer. We're going to be thinking about the historical Jesus and reasons to think that he actually existed. For those of you who don't know me, I'm currently in the Perth Hills. I grew up around here, and after school I went to uni. I studied chemical engineering, and then I worked as a chemical engineer for a little while before moving to the UK to study theology and apologetics, and I did that with Dan Patterson, who's one of your homeboys. So I love sports, I love good food, animals, and hanging out with friends and family, so kind of standard details, I suppose. And something that might be helpful for some of you is I broke a 10-year friend zone before I started going out with my now wife. So if there are any of you stuck in that dark place, feel free to send me an email with some questions later, and maybe I'll run a workshop one day. When I got to uni, I was confronted with the fact that I was one of only a few Christians in my course of chemical engineers, and it really made me think through, why am I a Christian? Is this stuff actually true? I'd had a good experience of Christianity from my family and the way that my parents had lived, and so I don't think I was resistant to it being true, but certainly wanted to know, is there good reasons to believe this stuff? And so I cared deeply about whether this stuff was true. I looked into it for myself. I went on to study these things a little bit further at the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics with Dan Patterson, and then I did some more study back in Australia. And so I've spent kind of half my academic life in the sciences with engineering and working in that, and then the other half kind of in theology and looking into those things. And so I'm going to share with you guys some of the things that helped me as I investigated these things for myself, and I hope it's helpful for you too. Just got to say right off the bat that I don't have all the answers, but the things we're going to go through are things that I found personally helpful and stimulating. One of the things I wrestled with when I was at uni was whether life could in fact have meaning and purpose if there was no God. I thought, well, if there is no God, then this life has no ultimate meaning or purpose. It's accidental and incidental. And so if this world isn't intentioned, it has no purpose. But if you pay attention to the way that people live, people can't live happily without a sense of meaning or purpose. And so they end up creating one for themselves. But it doesn't seem to be as durable as a meaning that you discover. And Jesus himself, it's recorded that he made the claim that he was the way, the truth, and the life. That he wasn't just a good moral teacher, but that he claimed to have the answers for life and how it should be lived. And so those claims warrant some investigation. And so that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be digging into them a little bit further. Now, some of you may be familiar with the famous C.S. Lewis trilemma, where he kind of posits that someone saying the things that Jesus said must be either Lord, lunatic, or liar. Now, I think actually in our current climate, in our kind of skeptical culture, people would actually more say, well, there's actually a fourth category that you haven't considered, that it's just legend. It's not just Lord, lunatic, liar, it's Lord, lunatic, liar, or legend. How do we even know Jesus existed? How do we know these things that he taught is really attributed to him? It's not just fabricated by someone else. And so it's worth thinking about, are these stories about Jesus real? And so as part of this series that Ashgrove Baptist is doing, we're thinking through, how can I be sure Jesus existed? And so there's a few points we're going to look at. Firstly, there's a wide range of sources that do attest to Jesus' existence. We have multiple reports from different perspectives. And thirdly, we have high quality eyewitness testimony from people who actually knew Jesus. And so we're going to work our way through these. In 2013, Time magazine ran an article on the most significant figures in history. And unsurprisingly, or maybe surprisingly for some, given that this is a secular publication, Jesus was ranked number one by a country or Australian kilometre, mile. He was so far outranked as the most influential person in history, it's worth going, well, who was this Jesus? Could the story of him have started out small, but then it just got exaggerated and elaborated over time? And so what we have now doesn't really have much resemblance to the original. And it's a good question, and it's an important question, because at the very heart of the Christian faith are claims about things that are meant to have happened between 5 BC and 30 AD in Palestine, or what we would now call Israel. And so, to get around an ancient figure, you need to get around the ancient sources. And so, how do we get to know Jesus? Is there reliable data? Is there old data? And you'll be surprised to know that, and maybe it's not a surprise for you, the New Testament is very early, well-preserved eyewitness testimony. Maybe you're familiar with them, maybe you're not. But what about non-Christians? Did they write about Jesus? Did they interact with him? Did they have an opinion on him? Now, it's worth noting, as William Lane Craig says, Jesus is referred to in a wide range of sources, both inside and outside the New Testament. Christian, Roman, Greek, and Jewish sources give us far more information about Jesus of Nazareth than we do for most figures from antiquity. And so let's just briefly survey some of these comments from extra biblical sources about Jesus, from Greek sources, Roman and Jewish. And so the first thing that shouldn't need to be said, but does need to be said because of the internet, is, did Jesus exist? Well, you can find very fringe people on the internet who will try and argue and persuade people to think that Jesus never existed. But the consensus view of historians is not in line with that. Edward Judge of Macquarie University says very early Christian sources and several non-Christian sources attest to the existence of Jesus in first century Palestine, putting his existence beyond reasonable doubt. Now, reasonable doubt is an important phrase because you can doubt it if you want. If you're that committed to it, you'll find reasons to back up your case. But he says actually the evidence does lie with the fact that Jesus existed in first century Palestine. John Dixon, who did his PhD at Macquarie University, an Australian historian and public advocate for the Christian faith, he put out a challenge and he said this: if anyone can find a full professor of classics, ancient history or New Testament in any accredited university in the world who thinks Jesus never lived, I will eat a page of my Bible. Probably Matthew chapter 1. He says it's been a year. Back then, it's probably 5 or 6 years now since he first put out that tweet. It was retweeted by John Saffron, who has 60,000 followers, and he says, my Bible remains safe. So I'm not going to be trying to argue over Jesus' mere existence. That's the consensus view of academics in ancient history, both skeptic and Christians, but we want to consider what do these non-Christian sources actually tell us that might corroborate or support some of the details in the New Testament. So how close can we get to Jesus? So let's start with the Greco-Roman sources, because they tell us some really interesting stuff from a non-friendly perspective. Our first little interesting piece of information, piece of data, is a bit of archaeology that can help us see where Jesus fit in his world. We literally do a little bit of digging. And here's a picture here that I'm going to enhance for you in a second. And you can see there, it's a bit of, it's a graffiti. It's scratched into a guardhouse wall in Rome's Palatine Hill. And it's a bit of anti-Christian graffiti. It's from either the 2nd or 3rd century. And the picture here shows a man worshipping a donkey-headed figure, another man, hanging on a cross. And it says next to it in not very sophisticated Greek, it says Alexamenos Sabete Theon, which means Alex worships his God. Now, it doesn't tell us anything directly about Jesus. It doesn't have the name Jesus on there. There's no visual way of knowing this is Jesus for certain, but it's a very strong clue, it's a very strong piece of evidence that tells us that the Romans thought that people worshipping a crucified figure of whom we know now to be Jesus, they thought that was just stupid. They thought that was ridiculous. So we know that early on, people were worshipping this figure as divine, and the Romans made fun of that. Going a little bit closer to Jesus on the timeline, we have the Roman historian Tacitus. Now, he wrote in about AD 114, and he refers to Jesus. He's often considered the greatest of the Roman historians, and most of our Roman history actually comes from Tacitus. Now, it's important to realize that Tacitus was no fan of Christianity, but that didn't prevent him from recording some important facts. He says this: Christians derive their name from a man called Christ, who during the reign of Emperor Tiberius had been executed by sentence of the Roman procurator Pontius Pilate. The deadly superstition, thus checked for the moment, broke out afresh not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but also in the city of Rome, where all things hideous and shameful meet and become popular. So it's relatively clear that Tacitus is not a fan of Christianity, but that didn't stop him from recording some salient details about Jesus, when and where he lived, that he was known as the Christ, and the circumstances of his death. A next little piece of information comes from Pliny the Younger, or Gaius Plinius Secundus, who writes a letter to Emperor Trajan. Now, he's stationed in... he's the governor of Bithynia, he's stationed in northern Turkey, and he writes to Emperor Trajan asking him, look, should I keep executing these Christians? Because I've done some investigation, and they're not really these incestuous cannibals that the rumours are suggesting. He was no fan, but he says this: the sum total of their guilt or error was no more than the following. They met regularly before dawn on a determined day, and sung a hymn to Christ as to a god. This is quite a significant letter. There's more to it. I've just taken out a small part. But what this shows is that already by 110 AD, Christians were already worshipping this man Jesus as divine. Next up, an interesting little source, again, doesn't refer to Jesus by name, but he's really the only one that is the best explanation, is Marabar Serapion. He writes a letter to his son from prison shortly after the Romans sacked Jerusalem in AD 70. Maybe he's writing about AD 75. His letter, we still have, it's in the Syriac collection of the British Library, but he finds comfort in the fact that other great teachers of the past had been persecuted, like Pythagoras, Socrates, and gives an example of this unnamed wise king of the Jews. And here's what he says: what advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. But the wise king did not die altogether. He lived on in the teaching which he had given. See, this figure isn't named, so we can't be absolutely certain, but since no one else really fits the description as a teacher, king, martyr, mainstream historians do take this as a bit of a passing reference to Jesus. So what do we get by this no means exhaustive list? There are other sources. There's Thallus and Suetonius who also mention Jesus. But here's what we can know by going back to already AD 75 from Greek and Roman sources. We know that Jesus existed historically. We know that he was known as a teacher. He was from Palestine. He was worshipped as divine. He was a supposed king, Christ, and he was executed by the Roman procurator, Pontius Pilate. But Romans and Greeks weren't the only ones to write about Jesus. After all, Jesus was a Jew. And so this leads us to another source, Flavius Josephus. Now, he published his history of the Jews in 20 books, so he wrote a lot. And there's a few references that he makes to Jesus in the 18th and the 20th books. And in the biggest of the two references, he says this: about this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, For he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such that people as accept the truth gladly. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to the cross, those who had first come to love him did not give up their affection for him. On the third day, he appeared to them, restored to life, for the prophets of God had foretold these things and countless other marvelous things about him. And the tribe of Christians so called after him has still to this day not disappeared. So you might be wondering, why would a Jewish historian describe Jesus as the Messiah? And so do historians. And John Dixon goes into this a little bit more in his great documentary, The Christ Files, looking at some of the ancient sources for Jesus. So what these historians think is that maybe an enthusiastic scribe has edited a few words. So one manuscript has that he was perhaps the Messiah. Another has that it was reported that he appeared alive. And yet most scholars do agree that there is an original core to this writing by Josephus that does tell us that the references to him as a teacher, as a wonder worker, and as a martyr do come from the pen of Josephus and tell us something about Jesus. In his second reference, Josephus also records the stoning of a man called James, the brother of Christ. And so that's just kind of a small passing reference. And so already by 75 AD, Jesus was already being referred to as the Christ, as Messiah, as God's anointed one. In the second reference, there's no suggestion by historians of tampering. And so here's what we need to say. Whatever you would make of these few debatable lines in the 18th book reference to Jesus, about Jesus by Josephus, most scholars do agree that these references to Jesus as a teacher, as a wonder worker, as a martyr, that they do come from the pen of Josephus and that they should be regarded as genuine. And so here's what we can say from non-Christian references to Jesus going back in time. We know he existed historically. We know his mother's and his brother's names, Mary and James. We know the ambiguous nature of his birth. We can pinpoint the time and place of his work in Palestine between 26 and 36 AD. He was famous as a teacher or miracle worker, or to put a negative spin on it, like the Greek intellectual Celsus did, a sorcerer. He was involved in, he was put on trial by Roman and Jewish people. He was hailed by some as the Messiah. He was executed by the Roman procurator Pontius Pilate. And Jews, Greeks, and Romans were all worshipping him as divine. Now, these are a lot of historical details, and they're important, broad, corroborating facts, but they don't really tell us much about what Jesus stood for, about what drove him to the path of martyrdom. And this is what leads us to the next part of our investigation, if we really want to get to know Jesus and his life, is what did he say about himself? And so this points us to even earlier sources for Jesus, which we now have in the New Testament. Now, some people would reject the New Testament and they say, yeah, no, they're Christian sources, but that's really not how historians see the matter. As I said at the beginning, I'm from the Perth Hills. I went to school in Midland at Swan Christian College, and so I spent many mornings at a place called Midland Train Station, which is kind of rough. And around Midland, there's someone who's somewhat of an urban legend now. His name is Mad Dog, or Adrian. Someone's made up this nice little picture of him to, I suppose, promote safe driving when cyclists are involved. And so you can see him there. He rides around on an old bike in stubbies and with no shoes on. And maybe he got the name Mad Dog because he barks at cars if they get too close or cut him off. Now, the thing you need to know about Mad Dog is there are loads of stories floating around about who Mad Dog is and where he came from and how he became the way he is. And his Facebook appreciation page, which will tell you some of these things. So here's some stories here. I've had to delete out some of the words. There's some people claiming that he lost everything about 30 years ago, and that's kind of why he went mad. He lost his missus, his kids, everything. Leave the poor guy alone. And I love this guy Dan Campbell commenting. He's like, come on, we need details. He's a a true icon, right? People are saying. And so this legend's developing. Next comment, he used to be a millionaire, but he went insane when his family died in a car crash. So this is the stuff people are saying. I love Terry French's comment here. He's like, look, that's Adrian, Mad Dog. He used to terrorize women and children in cars at the traffic lights. He'd sneak up on them and bark and growl at them through the open windows, and he used to scare them. And so all these people are putting in their comments and embellishing these stories and this legend about Mad Dog. Someone is going, oh, look, he must have a few years on him now. I remember, when he would terrorize people around Vic Park, and he's called a true Aussie icon. But here's a comment from someone who actually knows Mad Dog, which is quite revealing. He says this: I actually know him, even though he's not talking to me at the moment, which I feel like gives it a ring of truth. And then he says, and the myth that he was driven insane because his family died is total crap. Sorry, I know this is for a Baptist church, so apologies, edit that out if that word's inappropriate. I'm just kind of going with the original sources for scholarly integrity purposes. But this story about Mad Dog that's get developed by people who don't know him then gets corrected by people who do. See, people knowing him doesn't mean that they're an unreliable source. I even heard a story about Mad Dog from my mum. My mum said she was in a Coles supermarket. She was getting something from the freezer section, and Mad Dog's come up to her and asked her to help her read the back of the packet. And so I was like, oh, Mum, I was in high school. I was like, Mum, that's so cool. You saw Mad Dog. And I was like, he used to be a millionaire, and he's like a genius who went crazy when his family died. And I'm just regurgitating the story I heard. And my mum stopped me, and she's like, he's not a genius. He can't even read. And I was like, oh, what? And so then that genius story was that bubble was burst for me. And then as I was thinking about it, and I was preparing this talk, I contacted her a while ago, and I said, Mum, when you saw Mad Dog in Coles, did he need your help to read the back of the frozen packet because he couldn't read or because he couldn't see? So he couldn't read because he wasn't able to, or he couldn't see because he didn't have his glasses or something. And she said, oh, that's a good question. And I thought, well, how would I get to know? Well, I'd either need to ask Mad Dog, or I'd need to ask someone close to him, someone like this guy Vince, who actually knows Mad Dog. Could it be the same with Jesus? That the way that we would actually get to know him personally, what he taught and what he was like, would be to get to know what the people who know him say about him. See, if we want any extra details about Jesus' life and teaching, we need to go to the New Testament, because that's where his closest friends and followers record the things he did and said. And so extra biblical sources, these non-Christian sources, they don't really tell us anything that we don't find in the Gospels or the letters of Paul, for instance. But they do kind of corroborate some details, so they're not irrelevant. But most skeptics would go, no, you can't consider the New Testament documents because they're too biased. They're inadmissible. They're written by religious people, and therefore, everything they tell us is kind of useless. It's just drivel. But look, historians do take this into account when they look at these documents, and so they have to weigh them up on their own merits as well. There's two levels of analysis when it comes to the New Testament documents. Is it historically valid, and then does it tell us spiritual truths? And really, they're two separate questions, and they depend on your presuppositions about God and our universe. But historically, you can do some analysis. I would want to ask the question, though, if you did live in the first century and you heard about Jesus and you really did do some investigation and you found out that this stuff about him was, you became convinced it was true, and then you became a source that, like Luke, you did some investigation and you wrote a source for Theophilus, would you be considered a Christian source or a non-Christian source? Well, you'd be a Christian source because you examined it and you became convinced it's true. And so to ask for more early non-Christian sources, it's kind of assuming it's not real, because if it is real, the earlier sources you have are going to be ones that are persuaded by its truth. And so what we have in the New Testament is quite powerful evidence that Jesus was legit. And so if it were all true, I really shouldn't expect to find all that many early antagonistic sources other than some of the accounts we find within the Gospels themselves that recount the way that people responded to Jesus. And it often shows us that belief is not just a matter of the evidence, but it's also a matter of the will. Actually, are we willing to examine this stuff and to see if it could be true and it could have implications for our lives? See, think about it. Would my report about my wife or some of my best friends like Dan Patterson, would those reports be inaccurate just because I'm close to them or have affection for them? No. Sure, you'd take that bias into account. There'd be some selectivity, I suppose, but the bias doesn't destroy the testimony. If it did, our legal system would completely break down. Testimony is not an altogether unreliable source. It's actually one of the most reliable sources of information we have. One philosopher, not a Christian, from Melbourne, C.A.J. Cody, says in his philosophical work, Testimony, he says that most of what you and I know, like in the high 90s percentile, is built on testimony. Even most of the scientific truths that we know is built on testimony. Most of us have not got a thermometer out and examined the water boiling for ourselves to see that it actually boils at 100 degrees Celsius. And even if we do, and we believe that it's boiling 100 degrees Celsius, we're still believing that the person who was writing the measurement on the thermometer is being truthful. See, most of what we know is built on testimony. And so it's not unreasonable that God would use testimony as a means to tell us things about himself. And so what we see in some of the New Testament documents, particularly the Gospel, it says this in Luke's Gospel. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. That's interesting because they're not only eyewitnesses, but servants of the word, meaning they put into practice learning and speaking about Jesus, and so they committed it to memory, and so there was a way of it being preserved. Verse 3, with this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. See, if you dig into the life and teaching of Jesus, I am absolutely convinced you will see someone unique and worthy of serious consideration. There was an interesting interview in 1929 that was done with Albert Einstein on Jesus. And he was asked the question, to what extent are you influenced by Christianity? He says, as a child, I received instruction both in the Bible and in the Talmud. I am a Jew, but I am enthralled by the luminous figure of the Nazarene in the Gospels. He's asked, have you read Emil Ludwig's book on Jesus? He says, Emil Ludwig's Jesus is too shallow. Jesus is too colossal for the pen of phrasemongers, however artful. No one can dispose of Christianity with a bon mot, which is a form of witty remark. The interviewer asks, you accept the historical existence of Jesus? Einstein replied, unquestionably. No one can read the Gospels without feeling the actual presence of Jesus. His personality pulsates on every page. No myth is filled with such life. See, this testimony is important because what he identifies is that in actually reading the Gospels, you don't just get an intellectual view. There is a sense, an experiential element within which Jesus is revealed. There's an even earlier source that I find would be interesting from a non-Christian source, from Pilate. He said this about Jesus. In John 19:19, he prepared and he fastened a notice to the cross that read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Maybe he was being tongue-in-cheek, but I don't think he realized how much truth he was speaking. And so my challenge to you is, if you really want to know Jesus, if he existed and what he taught and what he stood for, if he's real, then are you willing to go to the earliest sources and examine them for yourself, and even pray, God, if this is real, please help me know. If there is a God and he's worked through Jesus, that prayer is completely reasonable. Not doing it because of prior assumptions, well, that's unreasonable, because you've closed off a possibility before you've even explored it. If you expect to go to the Bible finding a watertight argument, you don't really find one. Because in the Bible, God doesn't give us a watertight argument, he gives us a watertight person. And in Jesus you see the grace and truth of God embodied in a way which not only appeals to our mind and answers our deep questions, but gives us hope, meaning and purpose in our lives going forward. And so I would hope that we would be willing to do what one young juvenile delinquent did, who was in trouble with the police. She was caught, put in juvenile detention, and she was just kind of given a Bible as a last-ditch effort by a police officer. And she started reading the Bible, and she read it, and she said it was as if the person of Jesus walked off the pages of the Bible and into my life. And I do hope, and I do pray that that might happen for each and every person who is genuinely willing to examine the evidence for themselves, while asking God that if he's real, he could make this known to them. So I pray that might happen for you. Amen.